What would you do if God told you to pack up your entire family, your spouse, your children, and without a penny to your name, go to a country that you had never been to spread the gospel? Would you do it? Would you have faith in God? What about if he tells you to lay hands on people for healing and have faith that he'll do it? Would you do it? Well, for the subject of today's Pentecostal history, the choice was very clear. When God said do, he did. I'm Jay Kennedy, and please join me today in Pentecostal history as we examine the life and ministry of the apostle to South Africa and the man of healing, John G. Lake. So John G. Lake was born in Ontario, Canada on March 16th, 1870. As a teenager, he and his family moved to Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan. And in that same year, he became born again at a Salvation Army mission. Now, he claimed to have become a Methodist minister at 21, but there are some people that dispute that. In 1893, he met and married his first wife, Jenny Stevens. They had 7 children together. Now, his early life was marked with a lot of pain and loss, as many biographies about him have captured. He had 15 brothers and sisters. However, 8 of them would die young of sickness. Now, after his brother became sick, the family sought out the help of a minister who had built his own town in Illinois called Zion, a man by the name of John Alexander Dowie. Dowie was a Scottish-born former Congregational and Salvation Army minister who had become exposed to healing, the doctrine of healing, through his own experience and his own study. They made contact with Dowie, and through the prayers of Dowie, his brother was healed. His sister, who had been battling cancer, was also healed. Now, his wife, Jenny, had been diagnosed with tuberculosis and heart disease, and the doctors had given up any and all hope on her. But John dove deep into his faith. He relied on scriptures like Acts 10:38, which strengthened him. He had sent a telegram to Dowie asking him to pray for his wife. Dowie had this machine that whenever prayers would come in, he would stamp the date that he prayed and the date he prayed, and would send the letters back to the people who sent him letters. And when he received the telegram from John Lake, he stamped it with this machine and said she would live and not die, and she would be healed. She was healed completely. These events in John G. Lake's life affected him, and they would influence him and where his ministry would go. Now, feeling a call and connection to Dowie, John G. Lake packed up his entire family and moved them to Zion, Illinois, the town that Dowie had founded. And he became an elder in Dowie's church, the Zion Catholic Apostolic Church. Now, his neighbor in Zion, Illinois, was a man by the name of F.F. Bosworth, someone who would also become very instrumental in the Pentecostal movement, and who I would do a video on at a later date. It is also at this time that he met Thomas Hesmala, who would become instrumental in his ministry later on. Now, in a later video, I'll discuss Dowie and his views and his life. But at this time, Dowie began to believe that he was the prophet Elijah, and it created a separation within his church. So Bosworth and John G. Lake and Thomas Hesmala and people like that separated from him, not because they thought ill of him, it's just he began to believe some strange doctrines. So they separated from his church. Now, accounts vary as to what he was doing following the separation from Dowie. Some reports have him as being a successful insurance agent and making $50,000 a year, which in equivalent today's money would be $1.3 million. So some accounts have him doing extremely well. He had founded a successful newspaper. There are others that disagree with that. What is known is that he was an upstanding member of society. Now, around 1906 into 1907, Lake and Bosworth and Hesmala, they heard of a revival that was going on in Los Angeles, the Azusa Street Revival. So they all hopped on a train and they went to go see what that revival was about. Now, when they arrived in Los Angeles, they met William Seymour, the leader of the Azusa Street Revival. And they were very impressed with him. They thought he was a good man. He had a funny way of talking, but he was a man of God. And they joined in that ministry, and they all received the baptism of the Holy Ghost. And it was in Azusa Street, after receiving the Holy Ghost, where he would be propelled into his next stage in ministry. Now, after receiving the baptism of the Holy Ghost, Lake began to feel a strong pull on his heart to go to South Africa to start ministering the gospel there. So he, his wife, Jenny, his 7 children, Thomas Hosmelek, and 3 other adults, packed everything up that they had, and they began the long journey to South Africa. They had barely any money. They just trusted God to lead them as they were going. Now, when they arrived there, they didn't have any place to stay, but they were met by a woman, and the woman had told them that God had given her a word that she had a house, and she was to allow a missionary that was coming to preach the gospel to stay in that house. And God supernaturally provided a place for them to stay while they conducted their ministry. Sadly, this ministry would come with hardships. People assume that just because they were Americans, they were rich. Very similar to what people do today with Americans. And a lot of the provision that was given to them in the early days was later on would not be had. And they would find that they would have to go without basic necessities such as food. Now, the work in South Africa was great, however, despite all the hardships. There was a plague that broke out, and people didn't want to bury the bodies because they were afraid of getting sick. Now, John Lake was not afraid of disease. He was a strong man of faith in that regard. And he would go out and bury the bodies. And people would tell him, like, hey, you're going to die. And he said, I'm not going to die. So he buried all these bodies, and there was no disease. Nothing took him. He didn't get sick at all. Now, as he began to minister, he began to preach about divine healing, and he began to have healing services. And people were getting healed. Massive crowds would come out to have his hands laid on them, and pray for healing. It got to the point one time where he was so tired because there were so many people that needed to be prayed over that he looked around. He saw a tree that had fallen over, and he went over. He laid his hands on the tree. He prayed over it, and he told the people, "Put your faith in God, not in me. If you go to that tree and touch it, and you believe in God and for your healing, you'll be healed." And people followed his instruction, and they put their faith in God, and people were being healed by touching the tree. And he came back later, and there was still crowds of people coming to pray and touch that tree to be healed. Now, sadly, as often happens in ministry, Lake did what a lot of pastors do, what a lot of ministers do. And unfortunately, he did not properly provide for his family because he was so inundated in ministry. And that's not a dig on him. That's just a reality. It's a harsh reality that at times can be true. His wife, Jenny, in 1908, passed away barely a year after they had arrived in South Africa. I believe it was actually in several months after they arrived in South Africa, because of malnutrition and exhaustion. And sadly, his children from Jenny would never forgive him for that. They always blamed him that it was his fault. It's just a constant reminder to ministers, make sure that, God is first, but God puts your family in your life. You have to make sure you provide for them and take care of them and their spiritual and physical well-being. Now, he continued his ministry in South Africa until 1913, and his sister Irene helped him raise the children while he continued his ministry. Due to loneliness and other factors, he moved back to the United States in February of 1913. His loneliness would be answered, however, and he would meet and marry his second wife, Florence Switzer, in September of 1913. And they would also have children. In 1914, he made his way to England and met with Pentecostals there, to talk about the spread of the ministry there. After he came back to the United States, he went to the General Assembly of the Assembly of God, and it is around this time that he stopped using the original name of his churches. He would call them the Apostolic Faith Mission, similar to what William Seymour and Charles Parham would. And after this time, he stopped using that. And it was at that time that he and his family moved to Spokane, Washington. And this is where he would enter the final and a big part of his ministry. In Spokane, he began to found healing rooms, places where people could come to seek for healing. And he began to train divine healing technicians and began to teach them in the ministry of healing. And Robert Slayton, in his books, God's Generals, has great notation on these things. This he also did in Portland. He also did it in parts of California, and he also did it in Houston, Texas. Now, in 5 or 6 years of him being out there, he is credited for 100,000 healings. 100,000. Think of that. 100,000 people receiving healing because of one man's ministry. Now, Spokane was named by a federal government representative as the healthiest city in America. Insurance rates went down because of the amount of healings that were happening. Even the mayor of Spokane recognized Lake's work and credited him as being a part of why Spokane was such a healthy city. A private public official, secular official, recognized Lake's work in helping the city become healthy. Unfortunately, even during this time in his ministry, his children felt abandoned by him and neglected by him. And his children have stories of when they would seek out his attention, or they would try to have a relationship with him, and he would be so focused on ministry. And that is the unfortunate negative side of John G. Lake's life, is oftentimes he did neglect his family for the sake of the ministry. Now, generally, when people talk about those sorts of things, they talk about them in a negative sense, as if that one fault colors the whole person. You have to take the person in totality. Yes, he may have had some struggles with his family, but he was also a man of God. And you have to remember that when you're making assessments of historical figures and people in your own life. Lake would continue in ministry until in 1935, after a Sunday school picnic, he went home and laid down, tired and drained from ministry. And his wife Florence found him later, having had a stroke. He suffered from that for 2 weeks, and then he passed away at the age of 65. He was a healer. He was a minister. He was a missionary. He was a servant of God. He worked too hard and gave too much, but he can never be mistaken as not being one of God's greatest warriors. The U.S., South Africa, and Pentecostalism in general would not be the same without the tireless, hard ministry of John G. Lake. Thank you for joining me in this installment of Pentecostal history. Please join us again in our next video when we discuss Maria Woodworth Etter, the mother of Pentecost. Thank you.